The iron law of medieval siege warfare promised protection to cities that surrendered quickly, but annihilation to those that resisted. What history's chronicles often obscure, tucked between tales of chivalry and honor, is that the worst of this annihilation fell upon women. When castle gates finally shattered and walls crumbled, the women trapped inside faced horrors that medieval writers struggled to record in full. The knights who composed poetry about courtly love by day became predators by night, and the church that preached mercy found ways to justify what followed. This is the story not of battlefield glory, but of what happened when the fighting stopped and the conquerors turned their attention to the conquered. Medieval Europe built an entire legal framework around the understanding that cities under siege faced a stark choice. Contemporary sources reveal that defenders typically had 3 days to negotiate surrender once a siege began. If they opened their gates within this window, the attacking force would usually permit the garrison to march away with honor, and civilians might escape with their lives and some possessions. But if a city chose resistance and eventually fell through storm or starvation, all promises of mercy evaporated. Siege warfare and the collapse of civilian protection. The customs governing siege warfare emerged from ancient Roman military tradition and evolved through centuries of conflict between Christian and Muslim powers. These customs made brutal economic sense to medieval commanders. A quick surrender saved time, money, and soldiers' lives. The threat of total destruction if cities resisted provided powerful incentive for defenders to capitulate early. Chronicles from the era reveal that this system functioned as intended most of the time. When walls finally broke, the customary law of war granted attacking soldiers the right to sack a conquered city for a specified period, usually 3 days. During this sanctioned chaos, normal rules dissolved. Soldiers who had risked their lives in the siege expected payment in plunder, and commanders knew that denying them this reward could trigger mutiny. Property could be seized, wealth redistributed, and the city stripped of valuables. But the right of sack extended beyond material goods to include the bodies of the conquered. Women became spoils of war under a framework that denied them agency or protection once their city's walls fell. Medieval legal scholars and theologians debated the finer points of just war theory, but these philosophical discussions offered no practical shield to women trapped in conquered cities. The reality, documented in administrative records, legal complaints, and scattered chronicle accounts, reveals that women face systematic violence regardless of their status, age, or innocence. The breakdown of civilian protection that modern laws of war attempt to prevent was, in medieval siege warfare, an accepted feature rather than an unfortunate bug. The treatment of women varied somewhat by region and period, but certain patterns emerge from the sources. Northern European sieges during the 100 Years' War between England and France witnessed particularly brutal treatment of civilians. When Edward III's forces captured Caen in 1346, chronicles report widespread violence against the population. Similar scenes unfolded across the continent whenever sieges ended in storm rather than negotiation. The collapse of protection accelerated when religious difference entered the equation. Crusading warfare removed what limited restraints existed in conflicts between Christian powers. Muslim women in captured Crusader cities faced treatment justified by theological arguments that labeled them infidels whose suffering served divine purpose. The siege and fall of Jerusalem in 1099 saw the slaughter of the city's Muslim and Jewish populations, with contemporary Muslim sources recording the particular horrors inflicted upon women and children. Christian sources from the First Crusade notably avoid detailed discussion of treatment of female captives, a silence that speaks volumes. Punishment and humiliation of women after capture. The moment of a city's fall marked the beginning of calculated humiliation for its female population. Soldiers flooding through breached walls or opened gates sought not just wealth but the assertion of dominance through violation. Medieval sources, when they acknowledge this reality at all, frame it through the language of divine punishment or natural consequence rather than as crime. Women became instruments through which victorious armies demonstrated total conquest and shattered the defeated society's ability to protect its own. Public humiliation served strategic purposes beyond individual gratification. By assaulting women in view of their families or communities, conquerors destroyed the social fabric of the defeated city. Medieval honor culture placed enormous emphasis on female chastity and male ability to protect female relatives. Systematic violence against women simultaneously degraded the women themselves and emasculated the men who had failed to defend them. This dual destruction helped break resistance and establish the conqueror's absolute authority over the defeated population. Class distinctions offered some women marginally better treatment, though this proved cold comfort. Noble women and wealthy merchants' wives possessed value as potential ransom targets, which provided incentive for soldiers to keep them alive and relatively unharmed. Chronicles record instances of knights claiming specific high-status women as personal captives, asserting property rights that other soldiers were expected to respect. This protection, such as it was, stemmed from economic calculation rather than chivalric sentiment. Women of lower status enjoyed no such consideration. Peasant women, servants, and those without obvious wealth faced immediate violence with no expectation of ransom or special treatment. Medieval military culture regarded these women as legitimate plunder, indistinguishable from grain stores or livestock. Legal records from the period reveal that even when such treatment was later prosecuted, penalties remained light or non-existent, as courts struggled to classify actions sanctioned by military custom as criminal. Religious institutions provided no reliable sanctuary. While medieval law theoretically protected churches and monasteries from plunder, this protection frequently failed in practice. Nuns faced particular danger, as their vows of chastity made their mistreatment symbolically potent. Sources document cases of entire convents suffering during city sacks, with the theological shield of sacred vows proving worthless against determined attackers. Monasteries that had carefully built reputations for sanctity over centuries saw their protections evaporate in hours of conquest. The duration of sanctioned violence typically lasted 3 days, following the customary period for sacking a city. During this window, military discipline effectively ceased as soldiers pursued their promised rewards. Commanders who attempted to halt the sack early risked losing control of their forces entirely. Historical accounts record that William the Conqueror's troops ignored his orders for restraint after capturing Dover in 1066, and similar incidents occurred throughout the medieval period. The machinery of violence, once set in motion, proved difficult to stop. Ransom, slavery, and forced marriage as spoils of war. For women who survived the initial sack, captivity brought new horrors disguised as salvatio. The ransom system that allowed noble male prisoners to eventually return home functioned differently for women. Families negotiating for female relatives' release confronted not just demands for money, but the permanent stain on honor that captivity implied. Medieval society assumed that female captives had been assaulted, rendering them unmarriageable and socially diminished, even if physically unharmed. The ransom industry that flourished across medieval Europe and the Mediterranean developed elaborate mechanisms for pricing and exchanging captives. Religious orders, like the Trinitarians and Mercedarians, specialized in raising funds to redeem Christian captives from Muslim territories, and similar organizations operated in reverse. But these redemption efforts focused primarily on male captives of military or political value. Women languished as lower priorities, their ransoms negotiated only when families could afford the price and were willing to reclaim daughters or wives whose captivity had socially destroyed them. Those women whose families lacked wealth or will to ransom them entered the medieval slave trade. Maritime powers like Venice and Genoa maintained active markets where captives from sieges and naval raids were bought and sold alongside slaves from other sources. After Alfonso VII captured Almeria in 1147, sources record that nearly 10,000 Muslim women and children were sent to Genoa for sale, partial payment for Genoese naval support during the siege. This wholesale enslavement of female populations represented standard practice when religious difference provided justification. Slave markets operated openly in major Mediterranean cities throughout the medieval period. Women sold into slavery faced futures as domestic servants, agricultural laborers, or concubines, depending on age, appearance, and the purchaser's needs. Legal codes carefully regulated slave ownership and trade while offering enslaved persons minimal protection. A woman purchased at auction had no recourse against her owner's treatment, no appeal to authorities, and no realistic hope of freedom without manumission or successful escape. Forced marriage provided another avenue by which female captives were absorbed into conquering societies. Knights and soldiers who claimed women during sieges sometimes formalized these relationships through marriage, transforming abduction and violence into legally recognized unions. Medieval marriage law in many jurisdictions required only the couple's consent, not parental approval, which allowed captors to pressure or coerce women into agreeing to marriage that legitimized their captivity. Once married, women lost any separate legal identity, becoming fully subject to their husband's authority with no recourse to natal families or previous social networks. These forced marriages served multiple purposes for the conquerors. They provided legal cover for ongoing exploitation, secured property rights if the woman possessed inherited wealth, and helped populate newly conquered territories with settlers loyal to the conquerors. In frontier regions where religious and ethnic groups contested territory, systematic